Well, good morning and welcome to our next iteration in our Clergy Conversation series. It is my great privilege to welcome today Mother LaClaire Atkins. She's going to be our Lenten Digital Retreat speaker, not this Sunday night, but starting next Sunday night for a few Sundays in Lent. We went to seminary together. There's a lot more I could say. Her bio is on our Happenings newsletter, but I wanted to start off by asking her, who you are, LaClaire. How did you end up, taking this thing at St. Paul's, and just tell us a little bit more about yourself.
First of all, good morning, everyone. It's nice to be here with you all. So a little bit about my background. So I am a South Carolina born and raised Native person in every sense of the word. I am a member of the South Carolina Band of Cherokee Indian, which is not a federally recognized tribe. There are 3 federally recognized Cherokee tribes, the Eastern Band, which is in Cherokee, North Carolina, the Western Band, which is out of Oklahoma, and then the United Kiowa tribe, and also in Oklahoma. So my family comes from the Eastern Band, but their traditional native lands spanned East Tennessee, Western North Carolina, Northern Georgia, and all of South Carolina at its greatest point. So my great-great-grandmother, Temperance, was a full-blooded Cherokee Indian, and she married a full-blooded Irishman who was working as an Indian agent at the time, and was sent down to South Carolina to remove the Indians from their land. And he met Temperance, and they fell in love and ran away to Florida together, is what we understand as a family from our papers and things like that. So kind of a Romeo and Juliet situation going on there. And then, let's see. So a lot of people ask me, well, if you're from South Carolina, how'd you end up in Nebraska? And I worked for the Episcopal Service Corps for a year, which it's a national program, but it's like a gap year. So it's like AmeriCorps, Vista, or Lutheran Volunteer Service Corps. And I did the program that's based in Omaha, and it's specifically geared towards discernment for holy orders. And so I lived there with 2 roommates for 9 months, and I worked part-time in a church that ended up being my sending parish for seminary, and then part-time working as a public relations intern for a lobbying group that lobbies the Nebraska legislature for children and families. So I was in Omaha for about 4 years before I left for seminary, and then in California for 3 years, and then back to Omaha, and now back home. So a lot of traveling there.
You've been all over, and you're a cradle Episcopalian, right?
I am. And it wasn't until I moved to Omaha that I realized I was a rare breed. So, but yes, I was baptized Pentecost of 1988. 2 of my godparents are priests, and I'm still very much connected with them. So yeah.
Yeah, and we met at seminary in Berkeley, and it was interesting. About a year ago, I emailed because our church has a historic connection with the Standing Rock Reservation, and our last rector, Cliff, was trying to reestablish some of that relationship, especially with all the history around Bishop Hare, who had been, I think, the 2nd rector here at St. Paul's, and took a couple youth missions trips out there. So a couple of the parents were like, during COVID, can we reach out and see if there's any way, if there's anything they need from us or vice versa. So I reached out, didn't hear back from the person for over a year, obviously, because it's been crazy. And they told us about an opportunity to partner with them to help, them get Bibles in the Lakota language, hymnals, prayer books. And that kind of spurred on this whole idea with how do we use this time period where we can't go on the missions trip to think about what is our relationship, what have we learned in kind of reinitiating and going into our roots? How can we go deeper? And with the, now that we're digital, the sky's the limit. And so I thought, like, who do I know that we could bring in to lead the retreat? And so that's when I reached out to you, and you said yes. But why did you say yes? What was it that you were like, okay, I want to be a part of this?
So I've been thinking about that question in particular a lot since you sent me kind of the interview questions you wanted to tackle. And, we often hear from people of color, it's not my job to educate you about microaggressions and things like that. And to an extent, that is very true. When you're in the midst of a toxic relationship that is full of microaggressions, I'm sure some of you can speak to that. It's not my job to educate you on how to be a better human being. But I come from a place where I do have something to offer. And if I have a willing audience who wants to listen and wants to know about me and wants to learn about my culture and my background, then I'm an open book where that's concerned. And hopefully through that relationship building process, learning can take place on both sides and bridges can be built that way. So.
Right. And so I think that's a wonderful vision of what these Sunday nights are going to be. And what can some people expect on these Sunday nights? We're going to be meeting 5 to 5:30. What else can people expect as they join us?
So I thought when we initially talked about doing these sessions, we were thinking 4 sessions, and I was like, okay, so what kind of content can I offer that would be meaningful, but also informative, that people can take away, something that people can take away with them. And as a culture, so one thing I wanted to say was that I know that you all have a historic relationship with the Standing Rock community, and Bishop Hare is quite the legend in the Midwest. I got to hear a lot about him when I was in Nebraska, because the Niobrara convocation that he initiated actually spanned both Nebraska and South Dakota. It was a diocese without borders in that sense, and they still gather yearly, and it's a big to do in that area. So I got to hear a lot about him and learn a lot about him. And but as a Cherokee person, I can only speak from my context. And so and Dan thought it was important to state, not all Indigenous tribes are monolithic. There are things that we share. And one of those things that we share are 4 traditional medicines. There are 4 principal medicines. And I thought we could do one session on each medicine, talk about some stories that have been passed down that incorporate those medicines and what they do and what they're used for, and how they heal people. And those medicines would be cedar, sage, sweetgrass, and tobacco. So we'll have a session on each one of those.
And that idea was really exciting because we're living in a time of so much sickness. And to be able to think about what are some things that traditional cultures can teach us about healing, I can't think of a more timely thing. And we are honored to be able to learn and receive kind of from this deeper wisdom that's been around for thousands of years. And we're just excited about that. And yet you're someone too, who went to seminary in Berkeley. Berkeley's all about the future and the new. And so you're someone who knows how to bridge multiple worlds. You understand European American culture, you understand Indigenous cultures. I think you're bilingual or trilingual, you're fluent in Spanish. How does that impact the way you understand the church's mission? And how can your experience as someone who has to navigate multiple spaces help the church to get better at building bridges instead of putting up walls?
Yeah, so I am fluent bilingual in English and Spanish, and I'm conversational in French and Portuguese. So I've always had a love of languages to connect with people. It's the first kind of entry point into a culture, to be able to communicate with someone. I did my entire junior year in college abroad in Spain, and I lived in a tiny town where nobody spoke English. So I really had to sink or swim in that sense. And so that really helped me become fluent in Spanish. And I've used it ever since. I graduated college in 2010. And back then, Spanish wasn't as prolific as it is today. It's really kind of outside of the Southwest. And so it's really grown in that sense. And I had a lot of people asking me, well, what are you going to do with a Spanish major? And I'm like, well, I use it a lot, actually. And I'm always trying to learn something new. And so languages is an easy way for me to have an entry point into that. As far as how that impacts my understanding of the church's mission, I think about the day of Pentecost, which is really important for me since that's my baptismal anniversary, and how in that moment, everyone understood in their own language. And that's what brought people together. They were getting the same message, but their culture, their individuality, their language was preserved and respected in that sense. And so I think that, to me, I see God in that moment saying, your differences are important, and your differences don't have to divide you. They can bring you together. And that's always just been a really profound story for me. So as a person who's had to navigate multiple spaces in the church, it's not just as a person of mixed culture. I have to navigate it as a young person. I have to navigate it as a woman. I have to navigate it as now a single mom. So it's layers. I always tell people, I'm like, the church is, people in the church are like onions. You have to peel them back one layer at a time, and all of those layers form the entire picture of the person. And when you put multiple people like that in a room in the church, those layers come together and they form the entire vision of the church as what it's meant to be. And so I really just try to be my authentic self, to not take things personally when people want me to conform and I don't. Because I don't want to compromise my integrity as a beautiful, beloved child of God in order to fit into a narrow box of other people's expectations. I don't think that that's the vision that God has for me, and I don't think that that's the vision that God has for the church as a whole. So
thanks for that. One thing I think that people wouldn't automatically know about you is you're an avid music lover.
yes.
And I remember, on Sunday mornings, we both were worshiping at St. Mark's in Berkeley, California, which is right across the street from, Cal campus. And you literally could walk there. It's like a 20-minute walk from Holy Hill, which is where the seminary was, through the campus there. But we would drive over real quick, and that way we didn't have to worry about that. And you sang in their world-renowned choir. Can you talk about your love for sacred Anglican choral music? That's a really big thing here at St. Paul's. And how does this connect with an ecumenical global view of music in the church for you?
Yeah. So I do love music, all kinds of music. I tend to draw the line at screamo music, just because you can't understand what they're saying. So kind of defeats the purpose for me. But I love everything from country to rap to rock to opera. I have been a musician my entire life. I've been singing in Anglican choir since I was 4 years old. It's one of the other benefits of being a cradle Episcopalian is you have access to that from a very early age. I played in the handbell choir. I'm a classically trained violinist. And so I sang alto for St. Mark's. And the choir director and organist, George Emblem, was the music professor at seminary my first 2 years. And he's not only an amazing musician, he's an amazing pastor. And when I left for seminary, I'd been singing in the choir at my sending parish, and I was like, well, you know, if I do end up being ordained, I'm not going to be able to sing in choir on Sunday mornings. I'm going to be busy doing other things. And so I need to say goodbye to choir. And I was having a conversation with George one afternoon, and he was like, "Oh, well, you sing. You should come sing in choir with us." And I was like, "No, no, no, no. I'm done with choir. I've said my goodbyes." And he was like, "Well, at least come to church one Sunday and you know, just see." And the way that St. Mark's is set up, they have to process in from the chapel and then around because the choir is in the back. And so I was sitting in my pew and I was so busy singing during the entrance hymn that I didn't notice how ginormous their choir is. They have a double choir that fills the entire choir loft. It's around 60 people at its height on a Sunday morning. And so I wasn't paying attention really. And of course I'm facing front for the service. And so I didn't think to look around. And then they went to sing the anthem. And I heard this most magnificent sound coming from behind me. And I literally turned around just gaping at this huge choir. And I was like, I have to be a part of that. I have to be a part of that. And you know, so I credit George with, you know, kind of sneaking me in there under the radar. And just letting me come to that conclusion on my own that you don't have to be done with choir if you're going to serve God in God's church in a particular way, you know. And I still love to sing. My mom has a piano upstairs and we sing together. And so it's a great deep love of mine. And so I appreciate being able to go to church and listen to that kind of music. As far as connecting it with a global view of music in the church, Dan and I got to take liturgical singing together. And there were 7 of us in the class total?
Yeah, it was a small class.
6 or 7 of us.
It was awesome. It was
It
good.
was a really great class, really great people. And this is a class where you have to chant in front of people. And for the first time in my life as an accomplished musician, I was the only one who had a significant music background. And so I felt kind of nervous. I was like, oh, I don't want to be that kid. And I felt so supported by my classmates in that, no, we love to hear your voice, like you should sing. And you know, because you can really teach us stuff, but they taught me more than they will ever fully understand about courage to get up there and do something that you don't feel confident in at first. And so that was really great. And we talked a lot about global music and, you know, my background with other cultures. I deeply love our tradition of Anglican music, and I think we can do a much better job of incorporating global music into our services. Those cultures have something to say about God too, and music is a universal language that everybody understands. And you know, when I first heard that salsa beat when I was in Ecuador doing mission, and I was like, oh, you moved to this? You know, feeling that spirit that the music portrays, and being able to connect with people on a molecular level, because I might not understand what you're saying to me, but I understand what you're saying to me when you sing the song, or you dance to this rhythm. That communicates feelings in a way that words never could. And so I think that the church could only ever be that much more enriched by giving into that experience.
So speaking about you know, new experiences, you became a priest right before the pandemic, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and
Yep.
me too. And it's like we were born into fire, you know. How has been ministering in a pandemic been different from what you were expecting going through seminary? What's been different? Because I'm sure that's like a normal question where people are like, oh, how's it different than what you expected normally? But then it's been a total curveball with the pandemic.
Yeah, I mean, everything's different. It's I've been in the church my entire life. I have a very particular view of what church looks like on a Sunday morning, um, that I want to defend with my life because that's my experience. Um, and nothing will be able to describe the loneliness of preaching to a camera in an empty sanctuary. Um, I didn't realize how much I relied on the people in the congregation to give me physical feedback, and to drive my sermons forward, um, to drive the way that I preside at Eucharist. Um, and it's just been such a strange feeling. I think that we were ordained for such a time as this, and not just because we're young and we know how to operate Zoom, but there's something about who we are that God has called for this particular moment. And that's not just for the priests and the deacons, that's for all the lay people who are going through this too. God has called us to this for something important. I don't know what it is, and I may never fully be able to put it together. Um, but yeah, it's been very different. I've really been trying to live into the sense of grief. Um, yeah, the grief has just been really profound, and not just sadness. It's grief, and not just my own grief. Uh, the people that I serve, their grief around the way things had to change in order to keep people safe. Um, but I also know, my culture teaches me that with great grief comes profound joy. Um, and there has been profound joy in little moments, throughout all of this. And I know that there will be an even greater joy when we can gather together safely again and experience church the way that, maybe not in the exact same way that it had been, but in a similar way, just being together. Um, so I look forward to that, in a lot of ways. But right now, I'm just trying to live into it moment by moment, live into the grief, let the grief take me where it needs to go, um, and really try and figure out how to put words to that, because I don't think that we're born with the vocabulary, um, to really process that. And I think that that's part of our role as clergy, is to help people find the vocabulary to process what they're experiencing.
I think that's a really deep point, talking about developing a vocabulary around grief and how exhausting I think it can feel to do that in the pandemic. And yet, in some ways, we have to do it. It's sink or swim. We have to develop it whether we like it or not. And I think this idea of grief has opened up space for all other kinds of grief, our own grief around the pandemic. We think about what happened with George Floyd. We think too,
Mhm.
it's opened up this space to talk about larger communal grief. And so the next thing we're going to do is we're going to show a video produced by the Office of Indigenous Ministries in the Episcopal Church. And it really deals with a lot of the grief in the missionary history between Native peoples and the white Episcopal Church. Um, could you explain a little bit more about why the content in there is painful, but a necessary primer for the work we're going to be doing during our retreat?
Yeah, so this is one of the great dichotomies of my life, right? Being raised in the Episcopal Church, um, and being a Native person, right? The two great loves of my life consistently at odds with each other. Um, and it, the reason that this is such a necessary primer is because it really gives you the detailed history of how my people were treated, by the church. Um, and I was telling Dan when we were brainstorming this retreat that, a little known fact that I didn't even know myself until I did some research is that Native peoples in this country weren't allowed, they were legally barred from practicing their spiritual practices until 1978. That wasn't that long ago. And so there's been this massive movement within Indigenous cultures to reclaim that part of themselves, to reclaim their language, to be able to pass that down. But so much has been lost in the interim. And the church is one of the largest culprits of that. And so, in order to be able to be a person who lives in both spaces, I have to confront this kind of pain on a daily basis. And so, in order to be able to do real meaningful work with people of other cultures, and for us doing this retreat with people of Indigenous background, it's necessary to have this information.
Thank you so much for sharing that. And it can feel intimidating, and we want to warn everyone the content is a little bit, it can be triggering. So if you're at a spaces where you're like, I don't want to watch, something like that, we totally want to let you know in case it's something you want to leave. But we also think that because there's this larger grief as a society, there's an openness and maybe even a tenderness where we can hear some of these truths, whether it's for the first time or maybe we're revisiting it in a way we wouldn't normally be receptive to, because we're all going through kind of this massive trauma as a society. So just wanted to share that, and we're going to screen share the video.
O Great Spirit, God of every people and every tribe, we come to you as your many children to ask for your forgiveness and guidance. Forgive us for the colonialism that stains our past, the ignorance that allowed us to think that we could claim another's home for our own. Heal us of this history. Remind us that
none of us were discovered, since none of us were lost, but that we were all gathered within the sacred circle of your community. Guide us through your wisdom to restore the truth of our heritage. Help us to confront the racism that divides us, as we confess the pain it has caused to the human family. Call us to kinship, mend the hoop of our hearts, and let us live in justice and peace, through Jesus Christ, the one who came that all people might live in dignity. Amen. Christianity included a triumphalistic spirit of world conquest. Pope Nicholas V decreed in the papal bull Romanus Pontifex,
invade, search out, capture, vanquish, and subdue all Saracens and pagans, and all movable and immovable goods possessed by them, and to reduce their persons to perpetual slavery.
The arrival of Christopher Columbus in the Americas in 1492, financed by Spain's Ferdinand and Isabella, was the beginning of colonization of this land and its inhabitants. The motivations for expansionist aggression were power and financial gain. England soon followed Spain and Portugal with colonization in the name of God and King. A church that was once persecuted for proclaiming God's shalom in the world later on proclaimed the doctrine of discovery under King Henry VII.
Christian sovereigns and their representative explorers could assert dominion and title over non-Christian lands with the full blessing and sanction of that same church.
Manifest destiny, a term that was coined in 1839 and revised in 1845 to sanction the colonization of North America. It was used to designate the belief that the United States was destined, even divinely ordained, to expand across the North American continent. Thousands were murdered and relocated in the name of manifest destiny. By 1920, 99% of all Native Americans were wiped out.
In 1955, a typical practice incorporating Native Americans into the Christian Church can be found in the opening invitation of the Niobrara Catechism.
What name did your parents give you?
My name is Owe Shicha.
What is your baptismal name?
My baptismal name is Nellie Badwound.
Nellie, I baptize thee in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Ghost. Amen.
The church told Native Hawaiians, wear our clothes, speak our language, give up your spiritual traditions, stop dancing and singing your songs, stop using your medicine and healing rituals, give up your heathen ways and act like us, because that's how Christians act.
Many and great, O God, are thy works, maker of earth and sky. Thy hands have set the heavens with stars, thy fingers spread the mountains and plains. Lo, at thy word the waters were formed, deep seas obey thy voice.
English words to a Dakota hymn long associated with 38 Dakota men who were hung on December 26, 1862 at Mankato, Minnesota, ordered by President Abraham Lincoln. As the condemned 38 walked through their execution, it is said they sang this Dakota chant. Today, this hymn reminds us of starvation, misunderstanding, mistrust, and hatred that led to the largest mass execution in the history of the United States. 4 days after Christmas of 1890, 150 Lakota men, women, and children were shot by members of the U.S. 7th Military Cavalry at the Pine Ridge Reservation. The wounded and dying were taken to a makeshift hospital in the local Episcopal church. Above the pulpit hung a Christian banner which read, "Peace on earth, goodwill toward men." Misunderstanding and ignorance about Native people resulted in tragic events like the sterilization of Native women. To what end did the Episcopal Board of Missions write in 1906 to 1907? The Church has ever recognized her duty toward the Indians. Many of them have abandoned the wigwam and the teepee and built for themselves comfortable homes in which to dwell, and became tillers of the soil. Superstition, ignorance, and savagery have given way to higher standards of morals, as the schoolhouse and the chapel have pushed their way into their habitations. Somehow, Christian values of goodwill and charity did not extend to Chief Joseph's people, the Nez Perce. In 1877, he said,
I am tired of fighting. Our chiefs are all killed. The old men are all dead. He who led the young men is dead. It is cold and we have no blankets. The little children are freezing to death. My heart is sick and sad. From where the sun now stands, I will fight no more forever.
In 2008, Presiding Bishop Catherine Jefferts Shorey opened a summit on poverty by asking 3 questions. 1. How can we help to break the cycle of poverty? 2. How can we become a place of refuge and healing for the most vulnerable members of our society? And 3. How might we be a prophetic voice for those who find themselves stuck in dead-end situations? Centuries of promises made and broken form part of the heavy links between the history of our nation and the present realities for Native people. Forgiveness is not words, it is action. Native communities experience epidemic suicide rates, extreme levels of unemployment, alcoholism, drug addiction, gang violence, rape, and domestic violence. The healing journey leads beyond the mere alleviation of poverty into the abundant provision of a generous Creator that seeks only that all creation would grow to its fullness of possibility and hope. To acknowledge its regret for this history of domination and violence, the Episcopal Church adopted Resolution D-035 for the explicit purpose of repudiating and renouncing the doctrine of discovery. In many ways, Indian ministry of the Episcopal Church began in response to the Minnesota Uprising of 1862. After years of government treachery and deceit, the Santee people rose up and broke free of the Minnesota Valley Reservation. Many lives were lost. And despite the fact that Christians among the Santee saved the lives of missionaries and some settlers, all of the surviving Indians were imprisoned and later expelled to the Dakota Territory. First convened in 1870, the Niobrara Convocation in the Dakotas continues to meet annually as an intentional commitment of the Episcopal Church aimed at bringing relatives together. Creator, we give you thanks for all you are and all you bring to us for our visit within your creation. In Jesus, you place the gospel in the center of this sacred circle through which all of creation is related. You show us the way to live a generous and compassionate life. Give us your strength to live together with respect and commitment as we grow in your Spirit, for you are God, now and forever. Amen. While we can say that no one living today generated these destructive abuses in the name of Christ, nevertheless, the structural world we have been adopted into has been undeniably shaped and determined by the historic forces of empire. Will you decide to reinforce those worldly structures, or will you reshape those structures to better serve Christ and all your brothers and sisters? In 1997 and 2006, the General Convention of the Episcopal Church passed decades of remembrance, recognition, and reconciliation to fully recognize and welcome Native peoples into the Episcopal Church, leading to the 2009 resolution to repudiate the doctrine of discovery, calling the Church to review its policies and programs with a view to exposing the historical reality and impact of the doctrine of discovery and eliminating its presence in its contemporary policies, program, and structures. To reflect upon its own history in light of these actions and encourage all Episcopalians to seek a greater understanding of the indigenous peoples and to support those people in their ongoing efforts for their inherent sovereignty and fundamental human rights as peoples to be respected. Will you continue in the Apostles' teaching and fellowship, in the breaking of bread and in prayers, to persevere in resisting evil, to proclaim the word and example of the good news of God in Christ, to seek and serve Christ in all persons, loving your neighbor as yourself, and to strive for justice and peace among all people, and respect the dignity of every human being?
I will with God's help.
In the words of the prophet Isaiah,
Is not this the fast that I choose? To loose the bonds of injustice, to undo the thongs of the yoke, to let the oppressed go free, and to break every yoke. The Lord will guide you continually, and satisfy your needs in parched places, and make your bones strong, and you shall be like a watered garden, like spring of water, whose waters never fail.
With God's help, we will. Amen. Isaiah 58, verses 6 and 11.
Let's take a moment to pause and just reflect in the silence. Would anyone like to share anything that's going through their minds, or does anyone have any questions as we start our Lent off by doing this hard but deeply healing work?
I got a comment and a question. Does anybody notice the new signs on Bethlehem Pike and Germantown Avenue?
Right.
And the sign that says, "Welcome to Chestnut Hill, settled 1704." I think that's the date, which I guess is when we folks moved out. The first of our folks moved out to Chestnut Hill. What about the Native Americans that were already here? Is that a suitable sign for our community?
That's a great question, George. And one of the things we're going to be doing today, which could be a first step in addressing that, is we're doing an outside liturgy focused on kind of starting off Lent with an understanding of Native American spirituality today at 3. And Mother LaClaire recommended this, that we start our service with a land acknowledgement, acknowledging the Lenape tribe on whose land this is. And so that will be a first step, I think, but there's a lot more that could be done. You raise a great question.
Change the sign.
Funny, George, I had exactly the same response when we saw those stone posts going up, and you sort of thought, oh, there's going to be a sign. And then the first time I saw the sign, I thought, oh, it just seemed flat-footed.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I better read it.
One thing that struck me, talk about the things that are painful, is to think that Abraham Lincoln had signed to have 39 indigenous folks hung. Was a shock. Given what he represents to the African American community in terms of the work he did towards emancipation, and then to see how indigenous folks were treated.
The thing that's slightly confusing about that statistic is that the situation was a little more complicated, in that there was a local trial, and there were way more people who were convicted to death. And maybe other people know more about this than I do, but it was hundreds, and that at that time Abraham Lincoln was intervening to try and reduce the number. So it's not that I'm not saying that any person who was killed is justifiable, but I mean, there was all sorts of local politics that, sorry, you probably know more than I do.
Well, I know a little bit. So, and you're both right. I think what Van points out is really important, that within each individual there's both, right? There's the drive to do good, and there's this underlying shadow side, and I think that that's more profound in politicians, and Abraham Lincoln, for the good, decent human being that he seems to have been, based on what we know of him from history. He's still a human being, and he had that shadow side, I'm sure, and he had probably a lot of pressure from people to show that he could do those things. As far as what happened with that trial, you're right. There was a local land dispute between the white settlers and the indigenous people. There were hundreds of indigenous people who were convicted and sentenced to death. And actually, the local Episcopal bishop rode on horseback to DC to lobby on their behalf. And so that's why the number was reduced from 100 to 39. And I think that was seen as a necessary compromise, that there had to be some sort of retribution, some sort of white justice, but that it was unnecessary for it to be hundreds of people. So now, I don't know how they chose the 39 people. I often wonder what process that took. But that's.
I think it was random. I think they just chose people randomly. They were just to represent the group,
which makes it that much more insidious.
Yeah. Sorry, I don't want to.
No, you're fine. Yeah.
What's really interesting too is Bishop Henry Whipple, who is an Episcopal bishop, I think went to Abraham Lincoln to argue that, the hundreds needed to be reduced. So there's that positive side of the church, but then there's also the negative side of the church too. And it's tough to be able, I think, for us sometimes to admit both of those things and hold the tension. Even with Abraham Lincoln, the great emancipator, I was watching the PBS documentary this week on the Black church, and Abraham Lincoln was like, it's okay to free enslaved persons. They need to go to Africa. They can't stay here. He was a part of that movement. And it's a side we don't always hear. And so I really appreciate you, Van, bringing up the intersectionality and the connections between, all of the complexity of how, systems of oppression work. And that's a really, really important connection.
Mm-hmm. When I thought, one of the things I love about this video, and I'll make another plug for it. I plugged it for Dan earlier. If any of you have not watched the series Yellowstone, I highly recommend it, because it deals with a lot of these same issues. There's a local Indian tribe that's trying to get back their land, and it's a story based around a family who owns the largest contiguous ranch in the United States. And of course, all of that was native land at one point. There are several indigenous characters who are played by indigenous actors. And one of them, her name's Monica, she gets offered a job at the local university to teach history. And she's talking to her supervisor, and she says, well, what version of Columbus's history would you like me to teach? And he said, your version. And she said, I'm more than happy to teach the next generation about the man who brought genocide to the Western Hemisphere. because that's the reality. And then you see her in class the first day, and she's very clear. You know, at the end of the video we just watched, it said nobody alive today is directly responsible for the system that we currently live in, right? We've all inherited it. And so to an extent, we're all victims of what happened in the past. We're either the minority who experience the direct repercussions of the system, or we're in the dominant culture who are victims of having to uphold the system because we've never been taught any different. And to just say that out loud, you know, you don't need to feel guilty for being white. But there is a responsibility of recognizing the role that you have as being a part of a dominant culture. And so as a person who walks the line between two, what's my role in helping people get to that point, is the question I often ask myself. So
it makes me think, LaClaire, a lot about our patron saint here, Saint Paul, you know, who was Jewish and also a Roman citizen, and how he was this bridge between the worlds. And I see a lot of, you know, your work, and I'm not sure there's easy answers to the question, but there's a calling into that based on who you are. And I think that's a gift to the church, a gift that we are grateful for, that you would come and help us to think through some of these things, and not just think through them, begin to think about what are ways to act, as George kind of reminded us, even with the sign, you know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I do think it's interesting, George, that it said settled in 1709 or whatever the date was. So it's probably a half step in the right direction, settled instead of discovered, right? So we'll give them that.
But we're doing the settling.
Right.
Not the folks that were already here. So,
Right. Yeah.
But the other connection between our church, St. Paul's, and that, you know, that largest mass execution was that Bishop Hare was a young minister and was out there. Well, you probably know this, but he was out there. He went out on this funny trip that isn't really clear whether it was for his wife's health or whether he was seeking. And he went out, I think it was 4 or 5 months after that execution, and was so horrified by what he saw. I mean, what the sort of legacy of it, and that somehow that steered him in a new course.
Yeah, there's a lot of mistrust even today among Native peoples with any kind of institution, but especially the church, because even when the church has done its seeming best, it still hurts. And I think for a lot of us today, it's about the lack of recognition that that's what's happening, rather than a continual hurt. You know, we're not currently harming people actively, but the church still, in a lot of ways, refuses to admit that they were a part of this really atrocious history. You know, one of the pictures that's in that video I thought was really interesting. I just noticed it this time, and I've seen it several times, that graduation ceremony, all of the little Indian children, they're in cassock and surplice. Like, you know, that must have been so strange for them. And, you know, when I was out in Berkeley, Dan, I don't know if you took this class or not. I took a course called Gospel of the Masses, and it was meant to introduce, it was really kind of geared toward dominant culture people, and it was meant to introduce dominant culture people to other cultures that lived within Oakland. And so we got to meet some 4th and 5th generation Oakland people, and that's a big deal in Oakland to be able to say I'm a 5th generation person from Oakland. And we went to Indian Health Services one day and got to meet some of the local tribes. And they talked about the work that Indian Health Services is doing now with people of my generation who are experiencing some of the really traumatic health issues, diabetes, heart condition, alcoholism, drug addiction, all those things that the video talked about, and how that centers around the study of epigenetics, which is how trauma is transferred through our DNA. And that's how we get this idea of generational trauma, right? So our grandfathers and our great-grandfathers and grandmothers experienced the trauma directly. And then because of what they experienced, that's now encoded in our DNA. And so we're experiencing some pretty awful health crises because of that. And so they made a really intentional shift in how they triage people. They no longer ask, what did you do to get to this point? You know, like, what did you do with your diet or whatever to become a diabetic or to have a heart condition or things that we would normally be asked if we went to a dominant culture hospital. They ask, what happened to you? Which I think is a much more profound way of addressing health in a holistic manner. What happened to you? And that's not just what happened to me directly, that's what happened to my family, you know? And I thought about that a lot. I'm like, my great-great-grandmother gave up everything and became white in order to survive. You know, we don't have much information about her parents, which is why we can't enroll in Eastern Band. Their restrictions, their enrollment restrictions are such that you have to be able to directly link your family to somebody on the 1924 Baker roll. And there are tons of people with her maiden name on that roll, but we don't know which one she's related to. And that trauma of completely whitewashing your identity just to be able to survive, you know, I experience effects of that in today's culture. And you know, that's not something that's unique to Indigenous cultures. That's something that a lot, I would say all minority groups experience to a certain extent. And even people like Dan's family, he shared with me his family immigrated. And when they did, you know, they gave up a lot of their culture and their language. And you know, there are lasting effects to that, to not being able to honor who you are as a complete, authentic person, because it's a matter of survival.
Go ahead.
When I was at Penn, I took anthropology, and the professor said the people that migrate, they do for 3 reasons: adapt, migrate, or die. So the you know, these white men come because they were adapting. They couldn't adapt, so they migrated. But then the Indians had the opposite. These people are descending on them, and they have to adapt, migrate, or die.
Mm-hmm.
So that's how you look at it, anthropology. You know, from anthropology's point of view. And I think of the Syrians. That's happening with the Syrians. They're migrating into Europe and not accepted. So it's very deep subject, actually. But I remember when I was 10, I was in a class where we had to read 100 books. We were trying to read 100 books, you know, in the school I was in. And there was a section of orange books, and 99% were about the white man moving west and the Indians attacking them. And one book, which stayed with me for life, was about an Indian chief and how brave he was to resist. And I mean, that's the other point of view, but only 1 out of the 9, how many books there were on that subject. But as a little child, you can be really affected by that. So it stuck with me.
Thank you for sharing that. And I think, you know, when you talk about how traumatic any kind of migration can be, and I think that's what's important about what that character shared in her classroom, was that the white man fled because of religious persecution, right? And so, we talk a lot about shadow side of stuff, which is a concept by Dr. Jung. And so the shadow side of that migration for them was that now they were on top because they were in power. And so what they couldn't see in the short term was that they were doing to other people exactly what had just been done to them.
Right.
And so it's that cycle of abuse that victims often experience. So if you've been a victim of something, you're that much more likely to do the same thing to someone else, because that's what you know. And so you think about how traumatic that kind of migration must have been for them, to then impose forced migration on other people. That's just one extra layer of trauma, because you're not choosing to migrate, whether it's because of an inability to adapt or because you're scared you may die. You're being told it doesn't matter if you're scared or that you can't adapt, you're moving anyway. So it's a lot. It's very deep. Yeah.
Albert, there's something you wanted to say?
Yeah, I was going to say, in terms of what LaClaire is talking about, I was just thinking about the Palestinian community. If you look at what's going on right now in Israel around the settlements, and around for over 60 years, the Palestinian and largely Christian community is being, there's a kind of genocide going on where they have no land, they cannot expand, and these settlements are being placed. So it's this, it's very much in front of us, but again, we're not paying attention to it. And our government is supporting it. Our taxpayer dollars is supporting it right in front. And so the pulpits are still preaching, go forth and multiply, have babies. There are lots of texts that we need to look at differently today in the light of what's happening in the planet. So this is very deep. I think it's a really profound way to begin Lent, for us. And we have this strong connection in St. Paul's with Bishop Hare. But again, what are some of the things that we should be proud of, and then what were the shadow things that we should not be proud of and learn from?
Yeah, I really appreciate you bringing up the Israeli-Palestinian situation. Growing up in the United States, I never really understood why politically we're pro-Israel until I took religion classes in college, and I was like, oh, okay, well, that's where this comes from. And yet there was a disconnect. And again, the power of Netflix. There was a show years ago called The Key that talked about, through personal stories, talked about it was set around the time that Israel became a state after World War II. And it's told, one part of the story is told through a grandfather's experience, who was a British soldier who liberated Birkenau and then was left behind to oversee the transition of Jews coming to Israel. Now, realistically, what happened with that was that the indigenous Palestinians at that point, who had been there for over 500 years, were pushed out to the West Bank, right? And slowly but surely had to concede their land, right? So a very similar situation. And what happened was families would take their house keys when they left, and they would pass them down from father to son, generation to generation, in the hopes that one day they would be able to go home. And that is something that is yet to be realized. But again, this is a group of people who have just experienced a great trauma when 6 million Jews are persecuted and murdered by a different dominant culture, and they want to feel safe, right? And so they go to the one place where they've always been taught that they would and should feel safe. This idea of home, this returning to the land of their ancestors, right? But the majority of these Jews that established Israel were European Jews who had no physical connection to the land at all, right? And so they moved in, and the indigenous Palestinians had to move out because there's just not enough room. And so I think it's important to be able to see this is not a unique issue, right? That we're going to be talking about. I'm going to share my context with you all, but this is something that happens all around the world, and it's happened to many cultures have gone through similar experiences, and so we really aren't that different, and we should be able to connect because of what we've gone through.
Thank you so much, Mother LaClaire, for your wisdom and for inviting us into this important conversation. And we are so looking forward to being able to journey with you this Lent. If you're interested in continuing the conversation and being a part of exploring more about this throughout Lent, join us, not this Sunday night, but next Sunday night from 5 to 5:30 over Zoom. And then afterwards, we're going to have a 15-minute prayer service based on the resources and the Office of Indigenous Ministries the Episcopal Church is providing. So if you'd like to be a reader for that, or would like to participate in that way, reach out to me. I can let Mother LaClaire know, and we'll get you on a rota. And today we're doing an outside liturgy that is also going to be a way for the families to begin this, because they don't always come on this adult forum. So we're starting this from multiple angles, but all are welcome. If you're around today, feel free to stop by around 3 to worship with us. Thank you so much. Could you close us out in a prayer, Mother LaClaire, and send us on our way?
Sure. The Lord be with you.
And also with you.
Let us pray. Gracious God, great Creator, lover of all souls, we enter into this journey together to be able to experience one another, to be able to pray with one another, to be able to listen to stories about our lives and our histories and our journeys that have brought us to this time and this place. We know that even in the midst of great pain and suffering and grief that may accompany those stories, that you have journeyed with us through it, and you will continue to journey with us as we hope for the joy that awaits us. Help us to really be present the next few weeks in this class as we learn about Indigenous spiritual practices, as we talk and listen and experience one another in this most profound season. Help us to be still as we learn, as we grow. And I ask all of this in the name of your Son, Jesus Christ. Amen.